What if I told you that one of the most disturbing television shows ever made is actually perfect to fall asleep to? Yeah, I know that sounds completely backwards. The Boys, Amazon Prime's brutally honest superhero satire, just dropped its 4th season, and whether you've watched every episode wide awake or you're someone who loves drifting off to the sound of interesting facts and behind-the-scenes details, you are in exactly the right place tonight. So get comfortable, pull your blanket up, close your eyes if you want, and let me walk you through some of the most fascinating things about the Boys season for that even hardcore fans might not know. We're going deep on the creative choices, the real-world inspirations, the actor experiences, and the little details hidden in plain sight throughout the season. No jump scares, no sudden loud moments, just a calm and thorough journey through one of the most ambitious seasons of television in recent memory. The Boys Season 4 arrived on Prime Video in June of 2024, and from the very first episode it made clear that showrunner Eric Kripke and his team had no intention of pulling any punches. The season picks up in the aftermath of the events of Season 3, with the political and social landscape of the show's universe feeling more relevant and more uncomfortably close to our own reality than ever before. That sense of uncomfortable familiarity is something the creative team has always leaned into, but Season 4 took it to an entirely different level, drawing from headlines, political movements, and cultural anxieties in ways that sparked massive conversations online. One of the most talked about aspects of Season 4 was the character of Homelander, played with terrifying brilliance by Anthony Starr. What many viewers don't realize is how much physical and psychological preparation Anthony Starr puts into each season of this show. For Season 4, Starr has spoken in interviews about the challenge of portraying a character who is simultaneously becoming more unhinged and more powerful. The writing team gave Homelander storylines that pushed the character's narcissism and need for validation to completely new extremes, and Starr had to find ways to make those moments feel authentic rather than cartoonish. The result was a performance that earned enormous critical praise, with many reviewers calling it the best work Starr has done across the entire series. Now here is something genuinely interesting about how the show handles its villain. Kripke and the writers have been very open about the fact that Homelander is deliberately designed to mirror certain real-world figures without being a direct one-to-one copy of any specific person. The goal, as the creative team has explained it, is to capture something more universal about the psychology of unchecked power, about what happens when someone with enormous capabilities is never held accountable and is constantly surrounded by people who either fear them or worship them. That psychological portrait is researched carefully, and the writers have consulted materials on authoritarian personality types, cult dynamics, and the psychology of celebrity to shape how Homelander behaves in Season 4. Speaking of research, the production team for The Boys is known for doing extraordinary amounts of homework before every season. For Season 4, the writers' room reportedly spent months studying political movements, media manipulation tactics, and corporate lobbying practices to ensure the satirical elements of the show felt grounded and specific rather than vague. This is part of why the show resonates so deeply with audiences. It is not just throwing wild ideas at the wall. Every exaggerated moment in The Boys tends to have a real-world anchor point that makes it hit harder than pure fantasy ever could. Let us talk for a moment about the production design of Season 4, because it is genuinely remarkable and not enough people discuss it. The visual world of The Boys has always been meticulously constructed to feel like our world with the volume turned up slightly. In Season 4, the design team put enormous effort into the Vought Corporation's aesthetic, expanding and deepening the visual language of what is essentially the show's central villain organization. The way Vought spaces are designed tells you everything you need to know about how the corporation sees itself. Clean, powerful, aspirational. All chrome and glass and American flags. It is visual propaganda built into architecture, and the production designers made very deliberate choices about every space Vought characters inhabit. The Seven, Vaught's flagship superhero team, got some significant changes in Season 4, and the costume and makeup departments had their hands full keeping up with the evolving nature of each character. The superhero suits in The Boys are not spandex and foam rubber. They are incredibly intricate garments made from high-quality materials that have to be both visually impressive on camera and functional enough for the actors to actually move in. Each shoot reportedly takes weeks to construct and thousands of dollars worth of materials. When characters get new suit variations or when suits need to show damage and wear, the costume team essentially has to build entirely new pieces rather than simply modifying existing ones. Carl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher, had one of the most dramatically complex arcs of Season 4, and Urban has talked publicly about how much he enjoys the challenge this character presents. Butcher is a character defined by contradiction. He is brutal and manipulative and genuinely dangerous, but there is also something deeply wounded and human at his core, and Urban works hard to keep both of those things visible simultaneously. For Season 4 in particular, the writing gave Butcher storylines dealing with mortality and legacy that required Urban to bring genuine emotional weight to scenes that could easily have felt melodramatic in less skilled hands. It is the kind of writing and performance combination that elevates genre television into something that genuinely matters. Here is a detail many casual viewers miss. The Boys is actually an adaptation of a comic book series created by Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson, published by Wildstorm and later Dynamite Entertainment between 2006 and 2012. The show has always taken significant liberties with its source material, expanding, changing, and sometimes entirely reimagining characters and storylines. By Season 4, the television version has diverged so substantially from the comics that viewers who have read the original source material are often just as surprised by plot developments as those who have never picked up a single issue. This is a conscious choice by the showrunners, who wanted the series to be its own living thing rather than simply a faithful adaptation. The relationship between the comic and the show is actually a fascinating study in how source material can be honored in spirit while being radically transformed in execution. Garth Ennis, the original comics writer, has been publicly supportive of the television adaptation even though it takes the story in very different directions. Part of what makes this interesting is that Ennis himself was writing a satirical critique of superhero culture, corporate power, and American exceptionalism back in the mid-2000s, and Kripke's team has found ways to update those themes for a very different cultural moment while keeping the core provocative energy of the original work intact. Now let us drift into something a little more technical and perhaps more soothing to think about. The visual effects work on The Boys Season 4 is staggering in its scale and ambition. This is a show that requires hundreds of individual visual effects shots per episode, everything from the relatively simple removal of wires and harnesses when actors appear to be flying, to extraordinarily complex sequences involving superpowers being used in violent and creative ways. The VFX team on The Boys has grown substantially with each season as the show's ambitions have expanded, and Season 4 reportedly had one of the largest visual effects budgets of any streaming show in 2024. One of the most technically challenging aspects of the visual effects work involves scenes where multiple super-powered characters interact with each other and with environments simultaneously. Coordinating those sequences requires incredibly detailed pre-visualization work, where the entire sequence is essentially mapped out in a rough digital format before filming even begins. This previs process can take weeks or even months for particularly complex sequences, and it involves close collaboration between the directors, the stunt coordinators, the VFX supervisors, and the actors themselves. By the time a major action sequence actually gets filmed, everyone involved has essentially rehearsed it dozens of times in various forms. Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight, has one of the most nuanced roles in Season 4. Her character has been on an extraordinary journey across the series, moving from naive idealism to hard-won cynicism to something more complicated and interesting than either of those things. Moriarty has spoken about the responsibility she feels toward this character, particularly because Annie resonates so strongly with young women in the audience who see their own experiences with disillusionment and resilience reflected in her story. Season forgave Moriarty material that explored new dimensions of Annie's character, and she has been clear in interviews that the collaborative atmosphere on set is a significant part of what makes those performances possible. The ensemble cast of The Boys is one of its greatest strengths, and Season 4 made excellent use of the established chemistry between these performers. Shows that have been running for multiple seasons sometimes struggle to keep ensemble dynamics feeling fresh, but The Boys has consistently managed to find new combinations of characters to put in scenes together, which keeps the interpersonal dynamics from going stale. Some of the most compelling moments in Season 4 come from unexpected pairings of characters who do not often share screen time, and those moments tend to generate some of the most memorable performances of the season. Let us talk about the music for a moment, because it is genuinely one of the show's secret weapons. The Boys has always had a masterful approach to music supervision, selecting needle drops that create ironic contrast between what is being shown on screen and what is being heard on the soundtrack. Season 4 continued this tradition with some genuinely inspired choices that viewers have endlessly discussed and debated online. The selection of songs is never random. Each piece of music is chosen to add a layer of commentary to whatever scene it accompanies, and the music supervisors work closely with the directors and the showrunner to ensure that the tonal balance between horror and dark comedy is maintained throughout. The original score of the show is also worth appreciating separately from the licensed music. The composer who works on The Boys has developed a distinctive sonic palette for the series over its run, and that score is subtler than the attention-grabbing needle drops but just as carefully crafted. The orchestral and electronic elements of the score work to create a sense of unease that runs beneath even the show's lighter moments, reminding viewers that this is fundamentally a dark world even when things appear to be going well for the characters. Here is something interesting about how Season 4 was written. The writer's room for The Boys is known for being a particularly creative and collaborative space, but it is also an intense one. Kripke has described the process of breaking stories for each season as involving enormous amounts of debate, with writers pushing each other to go further and be more specific in their critiques and their character work. For Season 4, some story ideas were apparently discussed for weeks before being either refined into something that made it to screen or set aside entirely. The ideas that get cut are often just as wild as the ones that end up in the show, which gives you some sense of the creative ambition at work in that room. The political satire in Season 4 was particularly pointed, and this generated a fascinating cultural phenomenon where people across the political spectrum simultaneously claimed the show was critiquing the other side. This is actually a testament to the sophistication of the writing. The show manages to create a funhouse mirror version of contemporary politics that reflects genuinely troubling dynamics in ways that feel recognizable without being so specifically partisan that they alienate half the audience immediately. Kripke has talked about this balance in numerous interviews, describing it as one of the ongoing creative challenges of making the show. Now, as you settle in and let your breathing slow down a little, let me tell you about the filming locations for Season 4. The Boys is primarily filmed in Toronto, Canada, which stands in for various American cities throughout the show's run. The production makes extensive use of Toronto's diverse architecture and neighborhoods, along with studio work at the city's major production facilities. For Season 4, the production reportedly used a wider variety of locations than previous seasons, partly to reflect the expanding scope of the story and partly to keep the visual experience of the show feeling fresh. Location scouts for a production like The Boys have an extraordinarily detailed job, finding spaces that can plausibly represent specific American settings while also being practical for filming. The stunt work in The Boys deserves its own dedicated appreciation. The stunt coordinators on this show are responsible for designing and executing some of the most creative and violent action sequences on television, and they do so while ensuring the safety of everyone involved. For Season 4, the stunt team developed several sequences that required entirely new approaches because the specific superpowers and situations involved had never been done before on the show. This is one of the ongoing creative challenges of working on a series with an ever-expanding set of superhuman abilities. Every new power essentially requires the stunt and visual effects teams to develop new techniques. Something that casual viewers might not appreciate is how much rehearsal time goes into even relatively brief action scenes. A sequence that takes up 30 seconds of screen time might represent multiple full days of rehearsal and filming. The actors who perform their own stunts in those sequences, and several of the main cast members do quite a bit of their own stunt work, spend considerable time working with the stunt coordinators to ensure that the movements feel authentic and that they can be executed safely at the required intensity. This collaborative process between actors and stunt professionals is one of the less glamorous but genuinely fascinating aspects of how a show like this gets made. Let us take a quiet moment and think about the writing of individual episodes in Season 4. Each episode of The Boys is a complex piece of work that has to balance multiple storylines, advance character development, deliver on the show's satirical agenda, and satisfy the entertainment expectations of a very engaged and demanding audience. The writers who work on individual episodes bring different strengths to the table, and the variation in tone between episodes is often a reflection of which writer or writing team took the lead on a particular installment. Some episodes lean harder into the dark comedy, others into the horror elements, and still others prioritize emotional character work. The skill of the showrunner lies in making all of those variations feel like part of a coherent whole. The directors of Season 4 came from a variety of backgrounds, and bringing in different directorial perspectives is a deliberate strategy on prestige television productions like this one. Each director brings their own visual sensibility and interpretive approach to the material, while working within the established look and feel of the show. The challenge for directors joining an ongoing series is understanding and honoring what has come before while also bringing something genuinely fresh to their episodes. The Boys has been successful at this balancing act because the showrunners are very clear about the fundamental visual and tonal rules of the series, while also giving directors meaningful creative latitude within those parameters. One of the most discussed aspects of Season 4 was its exploration of found family dynamics and the way that trauma shapes bonds between people. The core group of characters around Billy Butcher has always functioned as a kind of broken family, people who have been hurt by the world in specific ways and who have found each other partly out of necessity and partly out of something more genuine. Season 4 pushed these dynamics in new directions, testing the bonds between characters in ways that felt emotionally authentic rather than contrived. This is the kind of emotional work that separates shows that are merely entertaining from shows that leave a lasting impression on audiences. The casting of guest and recurring characters in Season 4 was handled with particular care. The show has always made excellent use of its supporting cast, and Season 4 introduced some new characters who were received warmly by audiences and critics alike. The casting process for a show like The Boys involves finding actors who can match the very specific energy the series requires, which is a delicate combination of dramatic capability, comedic timing, physical presence, and the willingness to commit fully to material that can be quite extreme. The casting directors who work on the show have developed a strong sense of what The Boys needs from its performers, and that institutional knowledge shows in the consistency of the casting quality. Here is a softer detail to think about as you drift. Many of the props used throughout Season 4 contain hidden details and jokes that are invisible at normal viewing distance, and often only caught by audience members who pause their screens or watch extremely carefully. The production design team puts enormous effort into creating a fully realized fictional world, and that includes populating that world with fake advertisements, fake news broadcasts, fake social media posts, and fake product packaging that all contain jokes and Easter eggs. Some of these details reference previous events in the show's history, others are pure jokes for their own sake, and finding them has become a beloved activity for the show's most dedicated fan community. The fan community around The Boys is itself a fascinating cultural phenomenon worth thinking about. The show has generated one of the most active and creative fan communities in contemporary streaming television, with fans producing art, fan fiction, analysis essays, video essays, and detailed annotation of each episode that sometimes reveals details the creators themselves had forgotten including. The relationship between the show and its fan community has been notably warm, with Kripke and many of the cast members being quite active on social media and engaging with fan responses to episodes. This kind of creator-to-audience dialogue has become more common in the streaming era, but The Boys has made it particularly central to how the show exists in the culture. Season 4 dealt extensively with themes of legacy, specifically the question of what people leave behind and whether any individual action can meaningfully change large structural problems. These philosophical questions are embedded in the plot and character work, but they are never stated explicitly. Instead, they emerge from the specific situations the characters find themselves in and the choices they make under pressure. This is sophisticated thematic writing, and it is part of why the show is taken seriously as social commentary rather than dismissed as simply extreme content for shock value. The balance between extreme content and genuine emotional depth is one of the defining creative achievements of The Boys as a series. The show contains material that is genuinely difficult to watch, scenes of violence and cruelty that are designed to be disturbing rather than exciting. But those moments are always placed in a context that gives them meaning, that connects them to the larger arguments the show is making about power and accountability and human nature. The writers have been clear that they do not include extreme content for its own sake, but rather to make points that gentler storytelling could not make as effectively. Whether viewers agree with those creative choices is a matter of personal taste, but the intentionality behind them is not really in question. Now let us settle even further into something quieter. Think about the editing of Season 4, which is a craft that operates largely invisibly when it is working correctly. The editors on The Boys are responsible for assembling the footage from multiple filming days into coherent scenes, then assembling those scenes into episodes, and working closely with the showrunner and directors to ensure that pacing, tone, and emphasis are all hitting the intended targets. Season 4 reportedly went through significant editing work in post-production, with some sequences being substantially reworked based on early screenings and feedback. This kind of iterative editing process is common on prestige television, and the willingness to keep refining material until it works is part of what distinguishes these productions from lower-budget work. The sound design of The Boys is another element that rarely gets the appreciation it deserves. The sound team is responsible for creating an immersive audio environment that makes the superhero violence feel real and grounded rather than cartoonish. This involves creating original sound effects for things that have no real-world equivalent, things like specific superpowers being used in specific ways. The sound designers draw from enormous libraries of recorded sounds and combine and transform them to create new sonic textures. Season 4 had some particularly impressive sound design moments, where the audio work was doing as much emotional work as the visuals. One thing that has been noted by critics and viewers alike about Season 4 is how well it developed its female characters in particular. The show has always taken the experiences of its female characters seriously, using their storylines to examine specific forms of power imbalance and exploitation that are distinct from what the male characters face. Season 4 expanded on this, giving characters like Starlight, Kimiko, and others material that felt both specific to their established personalities and genuinely surprising in its emotional depth. The writers who worked most closely on these character arcs have spoken about doing deliberate research to ensure these storylines felt authentic rather than exploitative. The character of Kimiko, played by Karen Fukuhara, has one of the show's most distinctive communication challenges because the character does not speak. All of Kimiko's emotional expression has to come through physical performance and context, which is a genuinely difficult acting challenge that Fukuhara handles with remarkable skill. Season forgave Fukuhara material that expanded the emotional range of this character in ways that were visually inventive and emotionally resonant, and the work she does is consistently cited by critics as one of the show's underappreciated strengths. Let the thoughts drift a little now, like leaves moving slow across water. The Boys is a show that asks its audience to sit with discomfort, to recognize things about the world we live in reflected in its distorted mirror, and to keep watching even when what is being shown is not pleasant. That is a challenging proposition, and the fact that millions of people have accepted that invitation season after season speaks to something real about the quality and the relevance of the work. Season 4 deepened that relationship with its audience, delivering a season that was darker and more emotionally ambitious than its predecessors while never losing the irreverent energy that made the show compelling in the first place. There is something worth appreciating about how long-form television storytelling works at its best. Characters in a series like The Boys develop over years of audience time, and the cumulative emotional weight of that development means that moments in Season 4 land with a force that would be impossible to achieve without everything that came before. When a character makes a choice that reflects who they have become over 4 seasons of story, the impact of that moment is multiplied by all of the history the audience brings to it. This is the specific gift of serialized storytelling, and The Boys uses it with genuine sophistication. As you settle deeper and the words become more like soft sounds than things you have to actively process, consider this. The people who make The Boys, the writers and directors and actors and designers and visual effects artists and editors and everyone else in the enormous collaborative enterprise that produces a season of television are doing work that they clearly care about deeply. The ambition and craft on display in Season 4 is not the product of cynical commercial calculation alone. There is genuine artistic investment in the show, a belief that it matters, that what it says about power and accountability and human nature is worth saying, and worth saying well. The Boys Season 4 is not perfect television. No season of any show is. But it is television that takes its audience seriously, that trusts viewers to engage with complex material and to follow character arcs through genuine darkness towards something that feels, if not exactly hopeful, then at least honest about the world. That combination of entertainment and purpose is rarer than it should be, and when it works, it is worth appreciating. So let those thoughts settle now. The Vought Towers gleaming in the fictional skyline. The complicated people doing complicated things in a world that feels uncomfortably familiar. The enormous craft and effort that goes into every frame. All of it can rest quietly at the edges of awareness now as your breathing slows and the night gets quieter around you. The boys will be there when you wake up, ready to be watched with full attention. But for now, let the facts and the details and the appreciation for good work done carefully drift you gently towards sleep. Season 4 delivered. The people who made it cared. And that is a comforting thought to carry into rest. Let me tell you something that most people who claim to be die-hard fans of The Boys completely get wrong. They think they know everything about this show. They've seen every season, they've got the merch, they can quote every line. But I'm about to share things about The Boys that will genuinely make you question how well you actually know this universe. Stay with me because some of these are going to hit different than you expect. The Boys is one of those rare properties that exists on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it looks like a superhero deconstruction story. But underneath that, there's a decades-long journey that started in a completely different medium, shaped by real-world frustrations, industry chaos, and creative decisions that nearly never happened. And the more you dig into that history, the more fascinating the whole thing becomes. So let's start from the very beginning because even the origin of this story has a fact buried in it that most fans completely overlook. Garth Ennis, the writer behind The Boys, actually created the comic series back in 2006. But here's what a lot of people don't realize. The comic was originally published by DC Comics under their Wildstorm imprint. It wasn't an independent project from the start. DC actually dropped the series after just 6 issues because the content was considered too extreme even by their standards. Think about that for a second. A company that has published some of the most violent and disturbing comics in the mainstream market looked at The Boys and said, "You know what? This is actually too much." That is a statement in itself. After DC dropped it, the series was picked up by Dynamite Entertainment, where it ran for its full 60 issues and became the complete story we now know. So the very existence of The Boys as a finished work is partly thanks to a publisher willing to let Ennis go where he wanted to go without interference. That creative freedom is baked into the DNA of the source material, and you can feel it in the tone of everything that followed. Now let's talk about the show itself because the journey from comic page to streaming platform was anything but smooth. The Boys television series was actually developed first for the American Broadcast Network. It was originally set up at Cinemax, which is an HBO subsidiary. The show was being built for that platform when Amazon Studios stepped in and acquired it. That transition happened in 2018 when Amazon picked up the show and immediately ordered it straight to series. No pilot, no development limbo. They saw what the creative team was building and committed to it right away. That kind of confidence from a streamer is rare, and it changed the trajectory of the show entirely because Amazon gave the creative team the freedom and the budget to go places that a traditional network never would have allowed. Eric Kripke, who most people know as the creator of Supernatural, was the showrunner brought in to adapt the material. And this is where it gets interesting because Kripke had actually been trying to develop The Boys for television for years before it finally happened. His persistence with this particular property is part of why the show has such a clear and consistent vision. This wasn't a project handed to him. He fought to make it exist. Let's talk about casting because there are some genuinely surprising stories here that most casual fans have never heard. Carl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher, one of the most iconic characters in the show, almost didn't take the role. According to what he has shared in interviews, he was initially uncertain about committing to a television series because he had primarily built his career in film. Urban had done major blockbuster franchises including Star Trek and Lord of the Rings. The idea of transitioning to a streaming series was a bigger mental shift than people might assume. What ultimately convinced him was the quality of the writing and the character himself. Billy Butcher is genuinely one of the most complex anti-heroes in modern television, and Urban recognized that. The rest is history, obviously, but that near miss is worth sitting with. Now here is something that surprises people when they find out. Anthony Starr, the actor who plays Homelander, the main antagonist of the series, is actually from New Zealand. His natural accent is nothing like the all-American voice he uses for the character. Starr has spoken about how he actually spent significant time developing the specific Midwestern American quality to Homelander's speech, understanding that the voice was as important as the physicality of the character. The way Homelander speaks is part of what makes him feel simultaneously approachable and deeply threatening. That contrast is entirely intentional, and Starr engineered it deliberately. What's even more interesting about Starr's portrayal is something he has described in interviews about his approach to the character. He doesn't play Homelander as a villain. He plays him as a person who genuinely believes he deserves everything he demands. That distinction completely changes how the performance lands. When you watch Homelander have a breakdown, it doesn't feel like a supervillain losing control. It feels like a deeply damaged person who never developed emotional regulation because no one ever held him accountable for anything. That psychological specificity is what elevates the performance from impressive to genuinely disturbing. Let's keep going because we are just getting started, and the production side of this show has details that are absolutely wild. The cape and costume design for the Seven, the show's superhero team, went through extensive development processes that most viewers never think about. Each costume was designed to simultaneously feel like a genuine superhero outfit and also carry an element of corporate branding. The design team actually studied real-world sports team uniforms and celebrity branding campaigns when developing the looks for the Seven because within the world of the show, these are essentially brand ambassadors as much as they are heroes. Every detail, including the colors, the materials, and the logo placement, was informed by marketing research. That level of world-building detail in the costume department is genuinely impressive. Here's something wild about the production that actually affects how you watch the show. The flying sequences for Homelander were among the most technically challenging shots in the series. The production team used a combination of practical wire work, green screen technology, and digital effects that have evolved significantly across the seasons. In the earlier episodes, the team was still developing the methodology, and there are subtle differences in how flight looks compared to the later seasons. Once you know this, you start noticing the visual refinements as the show progressed. Now let's shift to something that gets into the deeper meaning of the show, because this is where it genuinely gets fascinating. Eric Kripke has been remarkably transparent in interviews about the political and social commentary embedded throughout The Boys. The show uses superheroes as a stand-in for unchecked corporate power, celebrity culture, and the gap between public image and private behavior. Kripke has specifically discussed how Vought International, the corporation that controls the Seven and essentially owns the superhero narrative in the show's world, was modeled after real media and entertainment corporations. The idea was to examine what happens when the entities that are supposed to protect people are more invested in protecting their own brand and revenue streams than in actually doing right by the public. What makes this commentary so effective is that it doesn't preach. The show trusts the audience to draw their own conclusions. The satirical elements are embedded in the story rather than delivered as lectures, and that's a delicate balance to maintain across multiple seasons and dozens of episodes. Now here is a fact that blows people's minds when they find out about it. The show has an internal Bible, a detailed document that outlines the world's rules, the history of Compound V, the corporate structure of Vought, and the backstories of every major superhero in the universe. This document is reportedly extraordinarily detailed, running to hundreds of pages. Kripke and the writers' room worked on this before a single episode was filmed because they understood that the satirical world they were building needed internal consistency to land its punches effectively. When a show's universe feels real, the commentary embedded in it hits harder. That investment in world building paid off. Let's talk about Compound V for a second, because the show's mythology around how people become superheroes is actually one of its most clever inversions of the genre. In most superhero stories, powers are either innate, the result of accident, or achieved through extraordinary circumstances. In the boys' universe, Compound V is a manufactured product. It's a drug. And the implications of that distinction ripple through everything. Superpowers become something that can be created, sold, weaponized, and controlled by whoever holds the patent. Vought doesn't just manage superheroes. They manufacture them, which means every superhero in this world is also a product. That's not just dark. It's genuinely unsettling in a way that feels uncomfortably relevant to conversations about pharmaceutical influence and corporate ownership of biological processes. The show has leaned into this mythology more deeply in each season, expanding the lore around Compound V and exploring what it means that something presented to the public as miraculous and natural is actually a corporate invention with a very specific and troubling history. Now let's get into some behind-the-scenes facts that are a little more personal and surprising. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey Campbell, the audience's entry point into the show's world, is the son of actors Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan. This is something people sometimes know, but what's less discussed is how deliberately Jack Quaid brings a sense of genuine relatability and vulnerability to Huey that is completely essential to how the show functions. Huey is not a cool character. He's not powerful, not intimidating, not particularly competent in the early going. He's the person in an extraordinary situation who doesn't really know what he's doing, and that's intentional. Having an everyman center character in a show this extreme gives viewers a consistent emotional anchor. Quaid's ability to make that character feel authentic rather than simply naive is underappreciated. There's also something worth noting about the dynamic between Jack Quaid and Carl Urban on set, which both actors have spoken about positively. Their characters have a fundamentally difficult relationship, full of tension and conflict, but the two actors developed a genuine working rapport that helps sell the complicated dynamic between Butcher and Huey. Sometimes the best on-screen chemistry comes from off-screen professional respect, and that appears to be exactly what happened here. Let's talk about Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight. Her arc across the series is one of the most emotionally substantial journeys in the whole show. But here's something about her character's development that speaks to how the writers approach their source material. In the original comic, Annie's character goes through extremely dark material that Moriarty and the showrunners chose to handle very differently in the adaptation. The television version of Starlight is more fully developed as a complete person with agency and a genuine moral perspective. The show took what was in the source material and built something more nuanced around it, which is a choice that not all adaptations make successfully. The fact that Starlight feels like one of the most grounded and real characters in a show full of extreme personalities is a testament to both the writing and Moriarty's performance. Now I want to spend a moment on Tomer Capone, who plays Frenchie, because his background is fascinating. Capone is an Israeli actor, and Frenchie is one of those characters who could easily have become a caricature. The European accent, the eccentric personality, the particular set of skills. In lesser hands with lesser writing, it could have been a one-note character. Instead, Frenchie is consistently one of the most emotionally affecting characters in the show. Capone brings a warmth and a genuine humanity to scenes that balance the show's more brutal elements. His chemistry with Karen Fukuhara, who plays Kamiko, created one of the most beloved relationships in the entire series. Speaking of Fukuhara, here's something genuinely impressive about her work on the show. Kamiko is a character who does not speak for much of the series. She communicates through expression, physicality, and eventually sign language. Playing a character without conventional dialogue is an extraordinary acting challenge, and Fukuhara makes Kamiko one of the most expressive and emotionally readable characters in the whole cast. That's not an accident. It reflects both her skill and deliberate choices about how to tell a story without words. Here's something about the show's music that most people haven't thought about. The soundtrack and score of The Boys is part of how the show weaponizes familiarity. Music you associate with comfort, patriotism, and heroism gets used in contexts that make those associations deeply uncomfortable. This is a deliberate strategy. When you hear something that sounds like an inspiring superhero theme underscoring something genuinely terrible, the cognitive dissonance creates a specific kind of unease that pure horror or drama can't achieve. The music team understood that they weren't just scoring scenes. They were participating in the show's satirical project. The show has also made extensive use of pop songs in ways that create jarring contrast. A bright, upbeat popular song playing over a scene of violence or corporate manipulation doesn't feel random. It feels like a comment on how culture packages darkness with palatable surfaces. Once you notice this pattern in the show, you can't stop noticing it. Let's get into some facts about the show's viewership and cultural impact because the numbers here are remarkable. When The Boys premiered on Amazon Prime Video in July 2019, it immediately became one of the most watched original series on the platform. But what happened between the first and second seasons is interesting. The gap between Season 1 and Season 2 saw the show's cultural footprint grow enormously, partly because audiences had time to discover it during streaming, share it with friends, and build the kind of word-of-mouth momentum that streaming shows often struggle to generate in real time. By the time Season 2 arrived, the show had become a genuine cultural phenomenon. The second season also benefited from the specific moment in which it landed. It arrived in late 2020, during an incredibly charged political and social period, and the show's themes about power, corruption, media manipulation, and the danger of charismatic authority felt almost uncomfortably timely. Kripke and the writers have talked about how they sometimes felt like they were writing satire and reality was trying to keep pace with them, which is not a comfortable position for a showrunner to be in. Now here is a fact about the show's production that speaks to the sheer scale of what they built. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, which stands in for the fictional Vought-controlled American city where much of the action takes place. The production design team does extraordinary work making Toronto look and feel like an American corporate environment, but there are subtle moments where the Canadian setting peeks through if you know what to look for. The production has spoken about this as both a practical challenge and a creative puzzle. Making a show that is fundamentally about American cultural pathologies while filming in Canada requires a specific kind of deliberate production design that the team has pulled off impressively well. Let's circle back to something deeper because I want to make sure we cover the aspects of this show that go beyond fun production trivia and get into why it actually matters. The Boys is genuinely unique in how it handles the question of power and accountability. Most superhero stories, even the ones that try to be dark or subversive, ultimately affirm the idea that there are good people in positions of extraordinary power and those good people will use that power responsibly. The Boys rejects this premise almost entirely. In the world of the show, the existence of unchecked power is itself the problem, regardless of who holds it. Even the most sympathetic characters in positions of power make choices that compromise their principles because the systems around them reward compromise and punish integrity. This is a genuinely radical position for a mainstream entertainment property to take and hold consistently across multiple seasons. It's one of the reasons the show generates the kind of passionate engagement it does. It's not just entertaining. It's making an argument. And whether you agree with that argument or not, the clarity of the show's moral vision is part of what makes it so compelling. Here is a behind-the-scenes fact that might genuinely surprise you. The showroom for The Boys apparently operates with an unusually open process for pitching story ideas. Writers at various levels of experience and seniority have reportedly been encouraged to bring their most extreme and unexpected ideas to the table, with the understanding that the show's premise creates space for almost any kind of social commentary if it's handled with craft. This kind of creative culture is relatively rare in television production, where hierarchy and creative gatekeeping are common. The result is a show that consistently surprises its audience because the writers themselves are encouraged to surprise each other. The spin-off series Gen V, which focuses on college-age superheroes in training at a Vought-funded university, came directly out of this creative expansion. The Boys universe is large enough and coherent enough internally that it could support an entirely separate show with its own tone and set of concerns. Gen V leaned more heavily into horror and the specific anxieties of younger generations navigating a world shaped by forces beyond their control, and it worked because the world-building foundation was solid enough to support it. Let me share something about how the show approaches its most extreme content, because this is actually important context that changes how you might think about certain scenes. The most graphic and disturbing moments in The Boys are not included for shock value alone. This is something Kripke has addressed directly. The show operates on a principle that extreme content has to carry thematic weight. When something viscerally uncomfortable happens on screen, it's supposed to make you feel something specific about power, about entitlement, about the ways institutions protect people who should face consequences. The discomfort is functional. It's designed to make you sit with something that polished storytelling would let you look away from. This doesn't mean every viewer will appreciate the approach. The show is genuinely not for everyone, and that's by design. But understanding that the most extreme moments are intentional and structured rather than random helps clarify what the show is actually doing. Here's a fact about Homelander specifically that I find endlessly fascinating. The character was deliberately designed to evoke a very specific type of American mythology. He looks like the idealized version of a patriotic hero, blonde, square-jawed, wearing the colors of the American flag. Everything about his visual presentation is designed to trigger associations with heroism, safety, and American exceptionalism. The show then systematically dismantles those associations by showing you who Homelander actually is beneath the image. The visual design is essentially a trap that the show sets for the audience, using the instinctive comfort we feel around those symbols against us. Anthony Starr has described understanding this function of the character as central to how he plays him. Homelander has to be genuinely appealing in certain moments, because if he was simply repulsive from the start, the critique wouldn't land. The danger of people like Homelander is precisely that they are compelling. That's the whole point. Now let me give you something that connects the show back to its comic roots in an interesting way. Garth Ennis, the original comic writer, has spoken about his mixed feelings regarding the television adaptation. He has been generally positive about the show's existence and its success, but he has also noted that the television version makes different choices than he would have made, particularly in terms of which characters receive sympathetic treatment and which storylines get expanded or compressed. This is normal for adaptations, but Ennis's perspective is interesting because it highlights just how much the television version is its own creative work rather than a faithful translation of the source material. The show has genuinely gone beyond the comics in terms of runtime and story development. With multiple seasons running to many episodes each, the television version has explored characters and storylines that the comics either handled briefly or didn't develop at all. In some ways, the show has created a more expansive version of this world than even the original creator envisioned, which is a remarkable thing to happen in an adaptation. Let's talk about the international dimensions of this show's success, because they're genuinely impressive. The Boys became one of the first Amazon original series to achieve truly global viewership numbers that competed with the largest streaming hits from any platform. The show found audiences in markets where superhero content had previously been dominated by the major Hollywood franchises, and in many of those markets the show's critique of American corporate and cultural power actually resonated in ways that were distinct from how American audiences engaged with it. Watching a show that deconstructs American cultural mythology from outside that culture hits differently, and that international engagement says something meaningful about the show's reach. Here is one more production fact that I think deserves attention. The stunt work on The Boys is extraordinary and largely underappreciated. The show features incredibly complex action sequences that involve practical stunt work combined with digital enhancement, and the stunt performers who execute these sequences operate under extraordinary pressure given the show's visual demands. Several of the show's regular cast members have done significant amounts of their own stunt work in order to maintain the visual continuity of action sequences. Carl Urban in particular has spoken about the physical demands of playing Butcher across multiple seasons, and how the action sequences have evolved in complexity as the show's budget and ambitions have grown. The fight choreography also carries thematic meaning in the show. The way the Boys fight compared to the way the Seven operate in combat reflects the power imbalance at the core of the show's premise. Normal humans against superhumans require completely different tactical approaches, and the choreography team developed a specific language for how each group fights that reinforces the show's underlying dynamics. Now here's something to consider as we come toward the end of this, and it connects everything we've been talking about. The Boys works because it takes its premise completely seriously. It doesn't wink at the audience. It doesn't soften its most uncomfortable implications. It commits to the internal logic of a world where corporate power has captured the function of heroism itself and asks what that world actually looks like for the people living in it. And the answer it gives is messy, painful, frequently darkly funny, and ultimately more honest than the polished fantasy of most superhero entertainment. The facts we've covered today, from the comic's troubled origins to the casting near misses, from the deliberate costume design to the thematic architecture of the score, from the political timing of the show's biggest seasons to the psychological specificity of the performances, all of these details point toward the same conclusion. The Boys is not an accident. Every element of it is the result of deliberate creative choices made by people who understood exactly what they were trying to do and fought to do it without compromise. That's what separates it from shows that simply try to be edgy or provocative. Edge without purpose is just noise. The Boys has always known what it's saying and why it needs to say it that way. That's why years after its premiere, it still generates conversation, debate, and passionate engagement from its audience. It earns that engagement by respecting the audience enough to never simplify its own argument. So the next time you watch an episode and something makes you deeply uncomfortable, sit with that feeling instead of immediately reaching for the remote. The discomfort is the point. The show is doing exactly what it set out to do. And knowing the history and intention behind it doesn't make it less impactful. It actually makes it more. If you've made it this far and there's a fact in here that genuinely surprised you or changed how you think about the show, drop it in the comments. I want to know which one hit different for you. And if you want more deep dives like this one into the shows and properties that actually have layers worth exploring, make sure you're subscribed because there is a lot more coming. See you in the next one. Look, I've been watching superhero content for years. I've sat through every Marvel phase, every DC reboot, every streaming disaster. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, has grabbed me by the throat and refused to let go quite like The Boys. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night. Most people think they know this show. They've watched it. They've talked about it. They've argued about it online. But I promise you, by the time this video ends, you're going to realize you barely scratched the surface of what's actually going on beneath the layers of blood, satire, and absolute chaos that makes this show one of the most brilliant pieces of television ever created. So stay with me, because some of what I'm about to tell you is going to change how you watch every single episode again. Let's start with something that sounds simple but is actually one of the most deliberately crafted decisions the show has ever made. The name Vought International is not random. The creators drew inspiration from real defense contractors and entertainment conglomerates to build a company that feels disturbingly familiar. Vought is essentially a composite nightmare of every major corporation you've ever had a complicated relationship with. It sells the idea of superheroes the same way a fast food chain sells the idea of happiness. The product looks amazing in the marketing. The reality is something entirely different. And that deliberate parallel to modern corporate America is baked into every single logo placement, every press conference, every smile Homelander flashes for the cameras. Now here's where things get really interesting. Carl Urban, the man who plays Billy Butcher, one of the most beloved characters in the entire show, almost didn't take the role. He had serious reservations. Not because he didn't love the character, but because he wasn't sure the show could actually pull off what it was attempting to do. The source material, the original comic series written by Garth Ennis, is genuinely extreme. We are talking about content that makes even the most shocking moments in the show look like a warm-up. Urban needed to be convinced that the television adaptation would find the right balance between being genuinely provocative and being gratuitous for no reason. Once the showrunner Eric Kripke got him on the phone and laid out the vision, Urban was in. And if you've ever watched Urban in an interview talking about Butcher, you can see that he didn't just take a job. He took on an identity. Speaking of Carl Urban, did you know that his accent in the show required more preparation than almost any other aspect of his performance? Urban is from New Zealand. Billy Butcher is from London's East End. Those are not remotely similar sounds. Urban worked with dialect coaches for an extended period before filming began, and he has spoken in interviews about how he essentially had to rebuild the way he physically forms words to make Butcher sound authentic. What's fascinating is that the accent itself becomes a character. There's a roughness to it, a working-class aggression that tells you everything about where Butcher came from before you even learn his backstory. That's not accident. That's craft. But let's talk about the character who arguably carries the most psychological weight in the entire show. Homelander. Played with terrifying precision by Anthony Starr, a New Zealand actor who, much like Urban, had to completely shed his natural voice and presence to inhabit this role. What most people don't realize is that Homelander was specifically designed to be a deconstruction of Superman, but not the cynical kind of deconstruction that just makes a hero evil for shock value. The writers wanted to ask a genuinely disturbing question. What would a person actually be like if they grew up with those abilities, in that kind of isolation, subjected to that kind of experimental pressure from birth, with no normal human development, no genuine love, no real sense of consequence? The answer they arrived at is Homelander. And it's horrifying because it makes sense. Anthony Starr has talked extensively about the preparation that went into Homelander psychology. He based elements of the character on research into narcissistic personality disorder, abandonment trauma, and the specific psychological profiles of cult leaders. That smile that Homelander does, the one that sends chills down your spine even when he's supposed to be doing something heroic, that was developed intentionally. Starr described it as the smile of someone who has learned that smiling gets you what you want, but who doesn't actually feel what the smile is supposed to represent. It's a mask that occasionally slips. And when it slips, that's when you see what's underneath. And what's underneath is something that didn't get enough of the right things when it needed the most. Now let me tell you something that genuinely blew my mind when I first came across it. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, but the production design team works overtime to make it feel like various American cities. The reason Toronto is used is partly financial, because Canadian production incentives make large-scale television significantly cheaper to produce, but also because the city's architecture is versatile enough to double for multiple American locations with the right dressing. What's remarkable is how successfully this works. The Vought Tower, the streets, the neighborhoods, all of it has been built, dressed, and filtered to feel distinctly American in its visual language. It's a deliberate construction of a place that represents America without actually being America. Which, when you think about the show's themes around image versus reality, feels oddly appropriate. Let's get into the comic books for a second, because the relationship between the source material and the show is one of the most fascinating production stories in recent television history. Garth Ennis wrote the original boys comic series starting in 2006. He created it as a genuinely angry, frequently grotesque response to what he saw as the sanitization of superhero stories and the cultural moment of the mid-2000s. The comic does not hold back. In ways that would be essentially impossible to put directly on a streaming platform, it goes to places that are designed to make you uncomfortable on a fundamental level. When Amazon picked up the adaptation, the challenge was enormous. How do you take source material that operates at a kind of creative extreme and translate it into something that keeps the spirit, keeps the rage, keeps the satire, but also functions as prestige television that can reach a mainstream audience? Eric Kripke's answer was to treat the comic as a starting point rather than a blueprint. Significant characters were reconceived. Story arcs were restructured. Tonal adjustments were made that changed some aspects dramatically. And in many cases, the show actually deepens the ideas that the comic introduced by giving them more space to breathe and more contemporary cultural targets to aim at. The result is something that longtime comic readers often find surprising, not because the show is worse, but because it becomes its own thing with its own logic and its own distinct personality. One specific example that's worth mentioning is the character of Starlight, played by Erin Moriarty. In the comics, Starlight's arc is significant but differs in some important structural ways from what the show does with her. The television version of Starlight transforms into something much more central and much more emotionally resonant than her comic counterpart. She becomes the show's moral compass in a way that gives the audience someone to orient around, someone whose perspective shifts alongside theirs as the world of Vought is slowly revealed to be exactly as corrupt as the most cynical person in the room always suspected. Moriarty herself has spoken about how the character evolved significantly through the writing process, and that she had ongoing conversations with the writers about who Annie January really is beneath the superhero identity. Here's a detail that a lot of viewers miss entirely. The Seven, the elite superhero team at the center of the show, is deliberately structured to parallel the Justice League in ways that go beyond just the obvious Homelander and Superman comparison. Each member maps onto a DC icon in a way that then exposes something specific about that archetype. The Deep has elements that parallel Aquaman, complete with the complicated relationship to an underwater identity that the character is made to feel embarrassed about. Queen Maeve has Wonder Woman energy, a warrior with ancient strength who has been so thoroughly compromised by corporate machinery that she can barely remember who she was before Vought got their hands on her. A-Train has a Flash parallel, a speedster whose entire identity has been consumed by the performance of being a speedster, to the point where the performance and the person have become almost indistinguishable. By setting up these parallels, the show can then systematically interrogate every assumption that the original archetypes carry with them. What does Aquaman look like when the idea of being a sea-based hero is turned into a branding opportunity? What does Wonder Woman look like after decades of being told by men in suits how to present herself to a public that will never fully understand her? The answers are uncomfortable because they're meant to be. Now let's talk about the production side for a moment, because the practical effects work on this show deserves way more recognition than it typically gets. The Boys is famous for its shocking visual moments. The whale scene, the first episode's ending, various other sequences that viewers tend to describe in hushed, slightly traumatized tones to people who haven't seen the show yet. What most people don't realize is how much of this is achieved through a combination of practical effects and digital work that is genuinely innovative. The effects teams have won industry recognition for their work precisely because the challenge is so unusual. Most visual effects work is about making something fantastical look real. On The Boys, the challenge is often making something real look even more viscerally present than it would naturally feel. The goal isn't seamless integration. The goal is impact. The exploding heads, a recurring motif in the show, require careful coordination between the practical effects department and the digital team. The initial physics of the event is often done practically, with rigs and materials that create a genuinely physical result, and then that physical result is extended and enhanced digitally to reach the precise level of visual intensity the scene requires. It sounds technical, and it is, but the reason it matters is because you can feel it. There's a texture to the show's violence that CGI alone could never achieve, and that texture is what makes the show's horror land with such force. Let me shift to something a little more unexpected. The music supervision on The Boys is doing something genuinely clever that I think flies under the radar for a lot of viewers. The song choices in this show are not just atmosphere or tone setting. They are editorial commentary. When you hear a specific piece of music playing over a specific scene, the show is often doing something deliberately ironic or confrontational, using the cultural associations of the song to create a third layer of meaning that exists between the scene's surface narrative and its emotional subtext. The most famous example might be the use of an upbeat, familiar piece of music playing over something deeply disturbing. The contrast creates a specific emotional texture that the show has made almost a signature. But the more you watch with attention to the music, the more you realize that every choice is intentional. The showrunners have talked about spending significant time in the writer's room discussing what a particular scene's music should achieve thematically, not just emotionally. That level of deliberateness in music supervision is rare in television, and it contributes enormously to the show's distinctive feel. Now, I want to talk about something that I think represents the deepest layer of what The Boys is actually doing. And this is the part where I want you to really pay attention. The show is, at its core, about power. Specifically about what happens to people and institutions when accountability disappears. The superheroes in the world of The Boys operate with impunity not because they're evil by nature, but because the system that surrounds them has been designed to protect them from consequences. Vought doesn't just sell heroes. Vought manufactures the conditions under which heroes can do whatever they want and never face a reckoning. Sound familiar? What Kripke and his writers' room have consistently done across the show's run is update their satirical targets to reflect the specific moment in which each season was being produced and released. The show has addressed media manipulation, social media culture, the celebrity industrial complex, political extremism, corporate immunity, and the way that charisma can be weaponized against populations who are desperate for someone to believe in. These aren't background elements. They're the actual subject matter that the superhero aesthetic is being used to examine. In interviews, Kripke has been remarkably transparent about the fact that the show is political by design, not by accident. He has specifically discussed wanting to create content that could cut through the noise of an extremely saturated media environment by being so viscerally entertaining that viewers would engage with ideas they might otherwise avoid. The superheroes are the delivery mechanism. The ideas are the payload. Here's something about the casting process that I find endlessly fascinating. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey Campbell, the closest thing the show has to a traditional audience surrogate and everyman protagonist, was cast in part because of a quality the producers identified as essential and genuinely rare. He reads as genuinely decent. In a show populated by characters who are compromised, damaged, corrupted, or operating in moral gray zones of varying density, Huey needs to function as the viewer's point of entry. He can't be too naive or he's annoying. He can't be too savvy or he loses the quality that makes him sympathetic. Quaid threads this needle in a way that even the writers have described as unexpectedly precise. What's interesting is that Quaid comes from significant entertainment industry family background, being the son of two well-known actors, and yet his interpretation of Huey is so grounded and specific that it never feels like a legacy casting choice. He did something distinct with the character. There's a quality of performance in Quaid's work that suggests genuine investment in who Huey is as a person, and that investment pays off across the arc of the series in ways that become increasingly clear as Huey is put through more and more pressure. Let me tell you about a behind-the-scenes element that surprised me when I first learned about it. The writer's room for The Boys is unusually large and unusually diverse in its composition compared to typical cable or streaming dramas. Kripke has made specific choices about who is in that room and what range of perspectives and experiences those writers bring. This has a direct impact on the show's content in ways you might not expect. The storylines that deal with race, with gender, with sexuality, with class, are not being written from a single homogeneous perspective and then polished. They're being generated and challenged by a room full of people who have different stakes in those conversations. The result is that the show's political commentary, even when it's provocative or uncomfortable, tends to have a specificity and an accountability to it that pure satire sometimes lacks. Now let's go somewhere that I think is genuinely surprising for most viewers. The relationship between The Boys and professional wrestling is something that the creative team has acknowledged, and that is built into the show's DNA in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Professional wrestling, at its core, is about characters who are presented as real performing narratives that everyone knows are constructed, while both the performers and the audience participate in a collective agreement to engage with those narratives as if they're genuine. This is called kayfabe, and it is exactly what Vought does with superheroes. The superheroes are performing characters. The public knows on some level that they're being sold something. And yet the emotional investment is real because the need that the performance fulfills is real. Homelandish rallies have the energy of wrestling heels working a crowd. The crowd knows they're being played, but the feeling they get from the playing is genuine, and that genuine feeling is the actual product being sold. This parallel between superhero culture and professional wrestling is something the show has leaned into increasingly, and it explains a lot about why Homelander's relationship with his fan base feels so eerily familiar. Here's another production detail that's worth knowing about. Filming the Homelander laser eye sequences requires an extraordinary amount of practical on-set work that then gets enhanced in post-production. Anthony Starr has to perform in very specific physical ways with specific eye directions and facial tensions to create the base footage that the effects team can then work with. In interviews, Starr has described the experience of performing a laser sequence as requiring a kind of physical concentration that is different from regular acting work because you're committing to a physical action while knowing that the actual visible result of that action will only exist in post-production. You have to be fully present in something you can't actually see. Let's talk about Soldier Boy for a moment, because the addition of Jensen Ackles to the cast in the third season is one of the more interesting casting decisions in the show's run. Ackles came into The Boys with an enormous existing fan base from his years as Dean Winchester on Supernatural, a show Eric Kripke actually created. That relationship between Kripke and Ackles spans more than a decade of creative collaboration, and the decision to bring Ackles into The Boys universe is loaded with that history. Kripke has been clear in interviews that he wanted Ackles specifically and wrote the role of Soldier Boy with that casting in mind. What's interesting about Soldier Boy as a character is that he functions as a deconstructed version of the classic American hero archetype, specifically the World War II era heroism mythology that American culture has used to construct a specific self-image. Soldier Boy is what happens when the mythology of American greatness is stripped down to its actual human components, and you have to reckon with what's actually there. Ackles' performance brings a quality that's essential to making this work. There's a genuine star presence to him, a physical confidence and charisma that makes it credible that this person could have been a symbol. And then the show systematically reveals the gap between the symbol and the reality. It's classic Boys territory, but executed with particular effectiveness because the casting itself does part of the thematic work. I want to circle back to something about Homelander that I think is the most psychologically interesting aspect of the entire show. The character's core wound is not about power. It's about love. Specifically, the absence of it during the developmental period when human beings are most vulnerable to its absence. Homelander was raised in a laboratory. The people who had authority over him treated him as an asset rather than a child. He was never taught to attach to other people in a healthy way because the environment he was raised in did not permit healthy attachment. The result is a being with the power of a god and the emotional architecture of someone who never learned how to be safe. This is why Homelander's rages look the way they do. They don't look like the calculated evil of a villain who has chosen a path. They look like the eruptions of someone who has never had the internal resources to regulate the size of what they feel. When Homelander destroys something, there's a quality to it that reads as terrifyingly childlike. Not innocent. The opposite of innocent. But childlike in the sense that the proportion between the stimulus and the response belongs to someone who was never given the tools to close that gap. Anthony Starr and the writers have described working through this psychology in granular detail, specifically because they wanted Homelander to be frightening in a way that was also comprehensible. Not sympathetic necessarily, but comprehensible. Because a villain who is purely and simply evil is not as frightening as a villain whose damage you can trace back to a source. One more production element that I think is really worth highlighting. The show's costume design is doing constant visual storytelling that functions completely independently of the dialogue and the action. Every superhero costume is designed as a statement about who that character is presenting themselves to be and what that presentation is concealing. Homelander's suit is the most obvious example. It's American flags and primary colors and the visual language of classical superhero design. And it sits on a man whose interior reality is the opposite of everything those design choices are supposed to represent. The costume is a lie, and it's designed to read as one once you know the character, while still being designed to read as the real thing to the crowd. The boys' look, the working class, lived in, practical aesthetic of their clothing and their environment, is equally deliberate. They wear what people wear when they're not performing anything, when they're just surviving. The contrast between the visual register of the superheroes and the visual register of the boys themselves is a constant silent argument the show is making about authenticity and performance. Let me give you something you can take away from this video and use the next time you're watching the show. When you watch a scene involving Homelander and a crowd of supporters, pay attention to where his eyes go when the crowd responds to something he's said. There's specific performance work in those moments. Starr has talked about playing Homelander's reaction to crowd approval as the closest thing the character ever gets to feeling genuinely fed. Not happy. Federation. Like the love of the crowd is a substance that fills something in him temporarily without ever actually nourishing him. And if you watch for that specific quality in those moments, you'll see it. It changes how the rallies feel. They stop being scenes of power and become scenes of hunger. That recontextualization is available throughout the show once you know where to look. The Boys rewards close attention in a way that a lot of action-oriented content doesn't bother to earn. The surface level is extremely entertaining on its own terms. But underneath that surface is a show that has done the work of a genuinely serious piece of culture, one that has something real and uncomfortable to say about the world that made it. Now here's something that I think is genuinely underappreciated when people talk about the show's legacy. The Boys arrived at a specific cultural moment. Superhero content had reached a kind of total market saturation. Every major studio had a shared universe. Every streaming service was developing cape content. The genre had become so dominant that it was starting to collapse under its own weight, with audiences showing early signs of fatigue in a way that the studios were struggling to acknowledge. Into that moment came a show that was not anti-superhero in the simple sense of just replacing good guys with bad guys. It was something more surgically precise than that. It was a show that identified the specific psychological needs that superhero stories fulfill in their audience, and then asked what happens when those needs are exploited rather than genuinely met. That question landed because it was the right question at the right time. And it landed in a way that didn't alienate the audience who loved superheroes. It landed in a way that made that audience think more clearly about what they were loving and why. That's a difficult creative trick to pull off, and the show pulls it off consistently across its run. The show's commercial success, which has been significant, is itself a kind of argument the show is making. It became one of the most watched properties on its platform. It generated enormous cultural conversation. It spawned spin-off content. All of this happened because it was doing something that the content it was criticizing had stopped doing, which was treating its audience as intelligent adults who deserve to have genuinely challenging ideas delivered to them inside genuinely entertaining packaging. And that, ultimately, might be the most interesting fact about The Boys. Not any specific behind-the-scenes detail, not any specific performance choice, not any specific production decision, though all of those are fascinating and worth knowing. The most interesting fact is that it exists at all. That a show this angry, this political, this willing to be genuinely offensive in service of genuine ideas, found an audience of millions. That it became mainstream without becoming safe. That it influenced how the industry thinks about superhero content at exactly the moment when that influence was needed. If you've been watching this show and you've enjoyed it without fully understanding why it hits differently than everything else in the genre, I hope this video gave you some of what you were looking for. The craft is visible once you know where to look. The intentions are accessible once someone points you toward them. And the experience of going back and watching with all of this in your head is something I genuinely recommend. Because there's a version of watching The Boys where you're just along for the ride, and the ride is genuinely excellent. But there's another version where you're watching a group of extraordinarily talented people who are angry about real things using the most entertaining possible vehicle to say those things as loudly as they can. That version is better. Drop in the comments which facts surprised you the most. And if you want more deep dives into the shows and films that are doing things that deserve more attention and more analysis, hit that subscribe button because this channel is exactly that. See you in the next one. You think you know The Boys. You've watched every season, you've followed the drama, you've picked your sides between Butcher and Homelander, and you genuinely believe you've got this show figured out. But here's the thing, there is a mountain of behind-the-scenes chaos, wild creative decisions, bizarre casting stories, and hidden details buried inside this show that most fans have never heard about. And some of this stuff is so strange, so unexpected, that it's going to completely change the way you watch The Boys the next time you sit down with it. So stay with me, because we are going deep today. Let's start with something that might genuinely shock you. The Boys almost didn't exist in the form you know it. The comic series by Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson, which the show is based on, was originally published by DC Comics under their Wildstorm imprint. Now here's where it gets interesting. DC actually cancelled the comic after just 6 issues. They pulled the plug on it because the content was considered too extreme, too offensive, and too politically charged even for a mature imprint. Ennis and Robertson had to take the book elsewhere, and it eventually found a home at Dynamite Entertainment, where it ran for its full 72-issue run. If DC had simply continued publishing it, the trajectory of how this story reached mainstream audiences might have looked completely different. The cancellation arguably gave the book more underground credibility and cult status, which eventually made Amazon take notice. Speaking of Amazon, the journey from comic to screen was not smooth or quick. The show went through years of development purgatory before it actually got made. Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg, who serve as executive producers, were involved in bringing the project to life, but it bounced around different networks and studios before Amazon Studios finally committed to it. There were genuine moments where it looked like the show was never going to happen at all. The subject matter was considered too risky, too controversial, and too difficult to market to a mainstream audience. People inside the industry thought you simply couldn't build a prestige television show around the brutal deconstruction of superheroes and corporate corruption. Amazon proved everyone wrong. Now let's talk about casting, because there are some absolutely wild stories here. Karl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher, was not the first choice for the role. Multiple actors were considered before Urban landed the part, and when you find out that Urban essentially lobbied hard for the job, it makes his performance hit differently. Urban is a massive comic book fan and actually knew the source material well before auditioning. He understood what Butcher was supposed to represent in ways that went beyond what's on the surface. That deep understanding of the character is part of why his portrayal feels so layered and complex. Urban reportedly pushed hard to get meetings with the showrunners and convinced them he was the right fit through sheer persistence and passion for the material. Then there's Anthony Starr, who plays Homelander, and this man deserves his own entire documentary. Starr is from New Zealand, and before landing this role he was perhaps best known internationally for the series Banshee. But the way he approached Homelander is genuinely one of the most fascinating acting choices in modern television. Starr has talked about how isolating it was to play the character, because Homelander is so thoroughly repellent and disturbing that he had to maintain a certain psychological distance from other cast members to preserve the on-set dynamic. The character works partly because of real tension between Starr and the rest of the cast, and Starr has leaned into that deliberately. There are stories from the set where other actors would feel genuinely uncomfortable around Starr when he was deep in character mode, which tells you everything about how committed he is to the role. What makes Homelander so terrifying as a character, and this is something the writers have discussed openly, is that he was specifically designed to be a commentary on a certain type of unchecked narcissism that exists in powerful institutions. The Superman aesthetic was chosen deliberately because Superman is the most universally recognized symbol of heroic virtue and goodness. Corrupting that image completely was the entire point. Every time Homelander does something monstrous while wearing that suit, the visual dissonance is the statement. The showrunners wanted audiences to feel that contrast as sharply as possible. Now here is a fact that a lot of people have missed entirely. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, not in the United States. The city of Toronto has been dressed up and disguised to look like a fictional American city so effectively that most viewers never notice. The production design team does an extraordinary job of hiding Canadian street signage, architecture details, and environmental elements that would give the location away. There's an entire department dedicated specifically to making Toronto not look like Toronto. When you go back and watch with this in mind, you'll start spotting small details you never noticed before. The budget for The Boys is substantial, but perhaps not in the ways you'd expect. A significant portion of the budget goes not into the superhero action sequences, but into the elaborate practical effects and makeup work. The show famously uses a combination of practical effects, prosthetics, and digital effects, and the showrunners have consistently prioritized practical work wherever possible. This was a deliberate creative philosophy from the beginning. Producer Eric Kripke, who created Supernatural and serves as showrunner on The Boys, wanted the violence and the grotesque elements to feel as real and physical as possible rather than clean and digital. That commitment to practical messiness is a huge part of why the show has a visceral quality that sets it apart from other superhero content. Let's talk about some of the specific scenes and the nightmares behind making them. The infamous submarine scene in Season 2, which involves a character being violently killed in an extremely graphic and bizarre way, became one of the most discussed and debated moments in the show's entire run. What most people don't know is that the scene was the subject of significant internal debate about whether to include it, how graphic to make it, and what purpose it was actually serving narratively. The writer's room apparently had extended conversations about the line between purposeful shock and gratuitous content. The decision to keep it in and to make it as extreme as they did came down to the show's core philosophy that superhero stories have been sanitized to an extreme degree and that confronting audiences with truly ugly consequences was part of the point. Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight, has spoken extensively about how physically and emotionally demanding the role is. What's interesting is how Starlight was developed differently in the television show compared to the comic. In the source material, Starlight's story is considerably darker and more one-dimensionally tragic. The show's writers made a conscious choice to build her into a more active and complex character with genuine agency, which required significant creative departures from the comic. Moriarty brought a lot of her own instincts about the character's emotional journey to the role, and the writers were receptive to collaborating with her on how Annie evolves across seasons. Toma Capone, who plays Frenchie, is actually Israeli, and his performance involves him speaking English with an accent that is somewhat ambiguous in its European flavor, which was an intentional creative choice. Frenchie's background is deliberately kept somewhat mysterious in the show, and that extends to his accent and linguistic patterns. Capone worked with dialect coaches extensively to craft exactly the right sound for the character. The chemistry between Frenchie and Kimiko, played by Karen Fukuhara, was something that developed very naturally during production, and the writers noticed it immediately. The relationship between those two characters became increasingly central to the show's emotional heart, partly because of how genuine the connection between the two actors was on set. Karen Fukuhara herself has an extraordinary story connected to this show. Her character Kimiko is almost entirely nonverbal, communicating primarily through physicality, expression, and sign language. Fukuhara worked with ASL consultants and movement coaches to develop Kimiko's specific physical vocabulary. The challenge of conveying an entire inner life, complex emotions, humor, grief, and rage without dialogue is enormous, and the fact that Kimiko is one of the most beloved characters on the show is a testament to how brilliantly Fukuhara handles it. There were conversations early in production about whether giving the character dialogue would make her more accessible, and the decision to keep her largely silent was ultimately maintained because it actually made her more powerful and distinctive. Here's something genuinely interesting about the show's political dimension. Eric Kripke has been very open about the fact that The Boys is explicitly political satire, and the show has been praised and criticized from multiple points across the political spectrum, which the creators take as a sign that they're doing something right. The interesting paradox of the show is that it has been enthusiastically embraced by audiences with completely opposite political worldviews, each seeing their own targets being skewered in the content. This was not entirely accidental. The writer's room deliberately constructed the satire so that no single political tribe could claim the show as their own. Vought International, the corporation at the center of the story, represents a kind of institutional corruption that transcends simple left or right categorization, which is what allows the show to function as genuine satire rather than partisan cheerleading. The Deep, played by Chase Crawford, was a character that could have easily been a simple comic relief villain, but the show took him somewhere considerably more interesting and uncomfortable. Crawford has talked about the challenge of playing a character who is simultaneously pathetic, dangerous, creepy, and occasionally sympathetic. The writers gave The Deep a storyline involving a cult-like self-help organization that was directly inspired by research into real-world cult dynamics and predatory wellness organizations. The satire there is pointed and specific, and Crawford committed to making the character genuinely sad rather than simply ridiculous. Now let's get into some of the more obscure details that even hardcore fans tend to miss. The show contains an enormous number of background Easter eggs, visual references, and hidden details that reward extremely attentive viewing. The fake superhero news broadcasts that appear in the show's world, the in-universe advertisements for Vought products, the fictional superhero merchandise visible in background shots, all of this is meticulously designed and contains jokes and references that are never explicitly pointed out. The production design team has essentially built an entire alternate history of superhero culture into the visual fabric of the show, and exploring that background world is its own hobby for the most dedicated fans. The character of A-Train, played by Jesse T. Usher, carries a storyline about performance-enhancing drug use among supes that was written as a direct parallel to real athletic doping scandals and the institutional pressure that drives athletes toward self-destruction. What's less known is that the writers also layered into A-Train's arc a commentary on the commercialization of black culture and athleticism specifically, which adds an additional dimension to his character's journey that some viewers pick up on and others miss entirely. Usher has discussed in interviews how important it was to him that A-Train not be reduced to a one-note character, and how he worked to find the human vulnerability inside someone who has compromised themselves completely. Let's talk about Garth Ennis, the original creator of the comic, and his relationship with the show. Ennis has been fairly candid about his complicated feelings regarding the adaptation. He was not heavily involved in the television production, which is common for comic creators when their work gets adapted. Ennis has expressed that some of the changes made for the show were things he wouldn't have done himself, while also acknowledging that adaptation requires transformation and that the show has its own valid identity separate from the comic. The most significant philosophical difference between the comic and the show is arguably in how the story treats its characters' capacity for redemption and growth, which the show explores with considerably more generosity than Ennis's original vision. The music choices in The Boys are another element that doesn't get enough attention. The show has made extraordinarily bold and often very funny decisions about which songs to use in which moments, and the music supervision team has developed a specific philosophy about how music can undercut or amplify the horror of what you're watching simultaneously. One of the most striking aspects of the show's musical identity is the use of upbeat, cheerful, or nostalgic songs during scenes of extreme violence or moral corruption. This creates a dissonance that is the audio equivalent of what the visual design does with superhero aesthetics. The specific song selections have often generated enormous online discussion and debate, which the music team clearly enjoys. Here's a fact about the production that reveals something about how seriously the show takes its world building. The fictional superhero team at the center of the story, the Seven, has detailed fictional backstories, in-universe biographical histories, and mythologies that exist in the show's world but that are never fully explained on screen. The writers have developed these backstories in depth internally, which then informs how individual characters reference their histories, even when those references are oblique or brief. This kind of deep world-building investment is what gives the show a sense of genuine weight and history that you can feel even when you can't fully articulate why. Dominique McElligott, who plays Queen Maeve, has one of the most interesting character arcs in the show's history, and her background is worth knowing. McElligott is Irish, and like Star, brings a non-American background to a character who is essentially a warped version of an iconic American superhero figure. Maeve's arc across the series, which involves her transition from complicit cynicism back towards something resembling moral courage, was something McElligott felt strongly about and advocated for within the production. The writers have described her as deeply engaged with Maeve's journey and insistent that the character's redemptive elements be handled with real care. There's also an interesting story about how the show handles the legal and clearance issues around superhero imagery. Because the show is explicitly about parodying and deconstructing the superhero genre, and because many of its characters are clearly designed as corrupted versions of trademarked heroes, the legal team working on the show had to navigate an extremely complex landscape of intellectual property law. The characters are always positioned just enough away from their obvious inspirations that they avoid direct infringement, while maintaining the cultural resonance of what they're referencing. This legal tightrope has actually become part of the show's creative texture, because the distance between the reference and the parody is itself part of the commentary. Now, Supernatural fans will know that Eric Kripke has a specific set of creative instincts around ensemble storytelling, mythology building, and the dynamic between characters who are technically working together but who have fundamentally incompatible visions of what they're doing. All of those instincts are visible in The Boys, but operating at a higher budget and a higher level of satirical sophistication. Kripke has talked about how his years running Supernatural taught him specific lessons about sustaining long-running ensemble narratives, and how to avoid the trap of running out of story while the audience is still invested. Those lessons are visible in how The Boys structures its seasonal arcs. Let's shift to something that involves the actual mechanics of filming. The show's fight choreography deserves more recognition than it typically gets. The action sequences in The Boys are notably different from those in mainstream superhero films, in that they emphasize the horror and consequence of superpowered violence rather than its spectacle and cool factor. When Homelander does something violent, the camera work and editing choices are designed to make you feel sick rather than exhilarated. This required very deliberate choreographic and directorial decisions to prevent sequences from accidentally becoming the kind of awesome action set pieces they were explicitly designed to critique. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey Campbell, has spoken about how Huey functions as the audience surrogate in a very specific and intentional way. Huey is the character who enters this world from outside it, who begins with recognizable moral instincts, and who the audience is supposed to track as those instincts get complicated and compromised by everything he encounters. Quaid has noted that there's a significant departure from the comic book version of Huey in terms of the character's overall demeanor and how he processes trauma, and that these changes were made to make him more relatable to a contemporary audience. The television Huey is softer and more emotionally articulate than his comic counterpart, which creates a different kind of tension around how the violence and moral compromise of his world changes him. The relationship between Butcher and Huey is worth examining in this context because it's one of the show's most carefully engineered emotional dynamics. From a screenwriting perspective, they function as a kind of dark mentor and reluctant student pairing where the mentor is not actually a positive influence and the student's challenge is to recognize that and chart their own course. Urban and Quaid have discussed how they work to find the genuine affection underneath Butcher's manipulative exterior, because without that affection, the relationship wouldn't work emotionally. Audiences need to believe there's something real between them, even while the show is clearly demonstrating that Butcher is using and corrupting Huey. Here's a lesser-known production detail. The show employs a significant number of consultants from various specialized fields who review scripts and production details for accuracy and resonance. This includes people with backgrounds in corporate communications, military operations, government intelligence, and public relations, all of whom contribute to making Vought International feel like a plausible and terrifyingly real kind of institution. The PR machinery around the Seven, the way Vought manages scandals and controls narratives, is written with a specificity that comes from actual understanding of how those systems work in real organizations. That research investment shows in the texture of the show. Something that has come up in multiple interviews with the creative team is the deliberate choice to make Vought International function as a critique of entertainment corporations specifically as much as a more than a generic corporate villain. The way Vought uses superhero mythology to sell products, manage public perception, and create emotional dependency in consumers is a portrait of how certain real entertainment conglomerates operate that is sharper and more pointed than it might initially appear. The show is in some sense a piece of entertainment criticizing the entertainment industry's own manipulation of audiences, which gives it a self-aware quality that adds depth to the satire. The spin-off series Gen V, which centers on a college for superpowered young people run by Vought, expanded the world of The Boys significantly and introduced a new generation of characters. What's interesting from a production standpoint is that Gen V was developed as a genuine creative expansion rather than simply a cash grab extension of the main series. The creative team on Gen V was given real latitude to explore different tonal registers and thematic territory, resulting in a show that feels connected to The Boys but distinctive in its own right. The relationship between the two shows in terms of how events in one affect the other was planned with considerable care to ensure continuity without either show being dependent on the other for comprehension. Let's talk about the show's approach to religion, because it's another element that tends to generate a lot of conversation. The Boys takes a complex and often darkly satirical view of how religion intersects with celebrity and power, and this is handled with more nuance than a simple anti-religious stance. The show is critical of how religious imagery and rhetoric get weaponized by powerful figures rather than being broadly dismissive of faith itself. This distinction is important and deliberate. The writers have been careful to show characters with genuine faith dimensions without reducing those characters to simple targets of mockery. The visual effects team on The Boys works under constraints that would be familiar to anyone who knows how television production works, which is to say they have to achieve cinematic quality results on a television timeline and at a television cost per episode, even accounting for the show's substantial budget. The way the show has worked around visual effects limitations is to use them strategically, concentrating resources on specific key moments rather than spreading VFX evenly across every episode. This produces a variable texture to the show's visual presentation that is actually artistically interesting, alternating between intimate, grounded scenes and moments of extravagant visual spectacle. One of the most genuinely fascinating aspects of the show's production is how the writer's room operates. Eric Kripke has described the writer's room as deliberately combative and generative, a space where ideas are attacked and defended vigorously and where the discomfort of that process is viewed as essential to producing sharp, surprising material. The show's willingness to go places that feel genuinely unpredictable and uncomfortable comes from a writing culture that specifically rewards proposals that make everyone in the room feel a little nervous. That institutional culture is a significant part of why the show maintains its edge. Billy Butcher's backstory, and specifically the details of what happened to his wife Becca, is handled quite differently in the television show than in the comic, and this change is one of the most consequential creative decisions the showrunners made. The television version of Becca's fate, and the introduction of Ryan as a character, creates a very different emotional architecture for Butcher's obsession and moral position. Urban has spoken about how important it was to him that Butcher's hatred of soups not be purely ideological but have a specific, personal, irreducibly human cost beneath it. The television version of Becca's story gives Urban's performance a different quality of grief that he draws on throughout the series. The show has also become notable for how it handles its female characters, which has been a subject of genuine critical discussion. The creative team has made deliberate efforts to ensure that female characters in the show have full and complex inner lives, rather than simply serving the stories of male characters. Starlight, Queen Maeve, and Kimiko all have independent character arcs with their own thematic weight. The show has not been perfect in this regard by any critical account, but the intention and effort to do better than the source material in this specific dimension is visible and acknowledged. Ryan's character arc across the latter seasons of the show is one of the elements the creative team has put particular emotional investment into, because Ryan represents something that no other character in the show does, which is the question of whether someone born into corruption and power with extraordinary destructive capability can choose a different path. The child actor cast in the role, Cameron Crevetti, has been given material that would challenge adult performers, and the show's handling of Ryan's psychology has been praised for its care and seriousness. Here's something worth knowing about the fan culture around this show. The Boys has generated one of the most analytically engaged fan communities of any contemporary series, with dedicated spaces online devoted to identifying background Easter eggs, tracking continuity details, analyzing character psychology, and debating the show's political meanings. The production team is aware of this community and has on occasion left intentional rewards for extremely close viewers, small details, and callbacks that only make sense if you've been paying close attention across multiple seasons. This creates a kind of meta-level engagement between the show and its most dedicated audience that functions as its own form of storytelling. The show's marketing has always been unconventional and often deliberately provocative, which mirrors the content of the show itself. Amazon has allowed the marketing team considerable latitude to promote The Boys in ways that play into its satirical universe rather than simply advertising it as a conventional television drama. The in-character social media presence of fictional entities from the show's world, the fake Vought advertisements, and the various meta-promotional materials have blurred the line between the show's fictional universe and the real world in ways that extend the experience for engaged viewers. As we come toward the end of what we've been looking at today, it's worth stepping back and thinking about what The Boys represents in the larger context of where superhero storytelling has been and where it's going. The show arrived at a specific cultural moment when superhero content had reached a kind of saturation point and audiences were beginning to show fatigue with the genre's conventions. The Boys didn't just subvert those conventions, it performed a kind of surgical deconstruction of them, examining why those conventions exist, who they serve, and what they cost culturally. That is a different and more ambitious project than simply making a darker superhero story. The influence the show has had on how the industry thinks about superhero content is real and ongoing. Conversations happening right now inside studios and at streaming services about how to approach superhero material have been shaped by the success and cultural penetration of The Boys. The show demonstrated that audiences were hungry for something that took the genre's premises seriously enough to question them, and that appetite has not disappeared. Eric Kripke has been candid that from the beginning, his vision for the show was to use the superhero framework to talk about power, specifically about what happens to human beings when they acquire power without accountability, and about the institutions that form around concentrated power to protect and extend it. Everything in the show, all the grotesque imagery, all the satire, all the character drama, is ultimately in service of that central inquiry. When you watch The Boys with that in mind, it coheres in a way that is genuinely impressive. Every excess, every shocking moment, every dark turn is pointed at the same question. That's what separates The Boys from content that is merely transgressive for attention. The transgression is intentional and purposeful. The discomfort it creates in viewers is designed to generate thought rather than just reaction. And the fact that it manages to do this while also being enormously entertaining, funny, and propulsive as a drama is the real achievement. Next time you sit down to watch it, you're going to see it differently. Because now you know what's underneath. Look, I need to be honest with you right at the start of this video. I have been watching superhero content my entire life. Comics, movies, animated series, all of it. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what The Boys actually is underneath the surface. Because most people watch this show and they see the violence, the chaos, the dark humor, and they think they understand it. They think they've figured it out. But there is an entire universe of facts, real decisions, real history, and real hidden details buried inside this show that even the most dedicated fans have completely missed. And by the end of this video, I promise you are going to look at The Boys in a completely different way. We are going to go deep today. Not surface-level trivia. Not the kind of stuff you find in a 10-second clip on social media. I am talking about the creative decisions that almost destroyed the show before it even started, the character details that were hidden in plain sight for years, the real-world connections that the creators deliberately embedded into every single season, and some things about the cast that will genuinely change how you watch every scene going forward. So if you have ever called yourself a fan of The Boys, stick around, because you are about to find out just how much you have been missing. Let's start with something that almost nobody talks about, and that is the origin story of how The Boys even got made into a television show in the first place. Because this was not a smooth journey. This was not a situation where some studio executive read the comic book and immediately said, yes, let's green light this thing. The Boys comic series, written by Garth Ennis and first published back in 2006, was considered by pretty much everyone in Hollywood to be completely unproducible. And when you read the original comics, you start to understand why. Ennis was writing a story that was deliberately designed to be as transgressive and as uncomfortable as possible. He was pushing against superhero culture at a time when superhero culture was just beginning to absolutely take over popular entertainment. The comic was initially published through DC's Wildstorm imprint, but DC actually cancelled it after just 6 issues because the content was considered too extreme even for them. It then moved to Dynamite Entertainment, where Ennis was able to finish the story the way he originally intended. So by the time this property made its way to Hollywood, it carried with it a reputation for being essentially too dark, too violent, and too politically sharp to survive the adaptation process intact. There were years of development attempts that went nowhere. The property bounced around, people were attached and then detached, and the general consensus was that any version of The Boys that could actually get made for mainstream audiences would have to be so watered down that it would lose everything that made it interesting in the first place. And then Amazon got involved, and specifically Eric Kripke got involved, and everything changed. Now here is something that actually surprises a lot of people when they learn it. Eric Kripke, the showrunner and the person most responsible for what The Boys became on screen, was the creator of Supernatural. That show ran for 15 seasons on the CW and was a very different kind of television. But what Kripke brought to The Boys was this deep understanding of how to balance genuine darkness with character work that makes audiences actually care about the people they are watching. He understood that you cannot just have shock value. You have to have heart underneath it, otherwise the audience eventually disconnects. And that balance, that very deliberate mixture of horror and humanity, is really the secret to why The Boys works as well as it does. But here is where it gets really interesting. Kripke has talked in interviews about the specific creative philosophy he and his team brought to the adaptation. They were not trying to faithfully reproduce every element of the comic book. In fact, some of the most beloved elements of the television show, some of the characters you have come to care about the most, are significantly different from their comic counterparts or were created entirely for the screen. And this was a deliberate choice. Kripke understood that what worked on the page in 2006 needed to be translated for an audience watching in a completely different cultural moment. The targets of the satire needed to evolve. The emotional stories needed to be deepened. And certain characters needed to be fundamentally reimagined to carry the weight the show required. Let's talk about Homelander, because you cannot talk about The Boys without talking about Homelander. Anthony Starr's performance as this character has been called one of the best villain portrayals in the history of television, and that is not hyperbole. But here is something fascinating about how that character was constructed. Starr has spoken about the approach he took to Homelander, and it is deeply rooted in a psychological framework of trauma and abandonment. The choices he makes in every single scene are built on this foundation of a person who was essentially raised without love, without genuine human connection, treated as an asset rather than a child. And Starr plays this not as a monster, but as a broken person whose brokenness manifests in truly terrifying ways. What makes this even more interesting is that Anthony Starr is from New Zealand. He is not American. And Homelander is perhaps the most aggressively American character imaginable, wrapped in a flag, the embodiment of a certain kind of nationalist mythology. The fact that this character is being played by someone who grew up outside of American culture actually gives Starr a unique perspective on what he is portraying. He can see the archetype from the outside in a way that perhaps an American actor might not. He has talked about studying the specific kind of performative patriotism and the hollow heroism that Homelander represents, and bringing that studied understanding to every scene. It is a performance built on observation and analysis as much as instinct. And then there is the relationship between Homelander and Stormfront in Season 2, which was one of the most deliberately provocative storytelling choices the show has ever made. The decision to frame that relationship as a kind of toxic romance between two characters who represent very specific and very dangerous ideological positions was not accidental. The writers were drawing direct parallels to the way extremist ideologies can be packaged attractively, how they can be made to seem exciting and even romantic before revealing their true nature. That is a specific, intentional message embedded in the narrative, and the fact that most casual viewers experienced it primarily as a dramatic storyline rather than as explicit political commentary is actually a testament to how skillfully it was executed. Now let's talk about Karl Urban and Billy Butcher, because this is a character with some genuinely surprising real-world dimensions. Urban, who is also from New Zealand by the way, which means both Homelander and Butcher are being played by New Zealanders, has spoken about the physical and emotional demands of playing this character. Butcher is written as this relentlessly driven, almost self-destructive force of nature, and Urban has talked about leaning into the working-class British identity of the character as a way to access the chip on his shoulder, the class resentment, and the sense of being an outsider within every system he operates in. But here is something that many fans do not know. The Butcher of the television show is actually a significantly more sympathetic character than the Butcher of the original comic books. In Ennis's original vision, Butcher is far more ruthless and far more morally compromised. The television version gives him a backstory and an emotional wound, specifically around his wife Becca and what happened to her, that makes him understandable and even pitiable in ways the comic version never really was. This was a very conscious decision by the writers to make sure audiences had someone to root for, or at least someone to feel complicated things about, as they navigated a show where almost everyone is deeply flawed. The Becca storyline itself is actually an invention of the television show that has no direct equivalent in the comics, and it fundamentally changes the emotional architecture of everything Butcher does throughout the series. His motivation is not just abstract revenge against Vought and against the Supes. It is deeply personal, and it is driven by love and loss in a way that grounds all of his extreme behavior in something recognizably human. That was a smart piece of writing because it gives the audience an emotional anchor in a show that could easily become overwhelming in its darkness without one. Let's shift to Erin Moriarty and Annie January, also known as Starlight, because her arc across the seasons contains some fascinating real-world dimensions that do not get talked about enough. Moriarty has spoken extensively about the emotional and physical demands of playing a character who is constantly navigating between her authentic self and the performance that Vought demands of her. That tension between authenticity and corporate image management is one of the core themes of the show, and it maps very directly onto real conversations happening in entertainment, in social media culture, and in celebrity culture more broadly. What is interesting about Starlight is that she was conceived from the beginning as the audience's entry point into the world. She is the character who starts out believing in the system, who has genuine idealism, and who we watch have that idealism systematically dismantled. This is a classic narrative device, the innocent character whose loss of innocence mirrors the audience's own journey into understanding the story's dark worldview. But what elevates it beyond the cliché is that Starlight does not simply become cynical. She keeps fighting, keeps trying to hold on to something real, and that stubborn refusal to give up is what makes her one of the most compelling characters in the show. Now here is something genuinely surprising about the production of The Boys that most people have absolutely no idea about. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada. Not in America. Not in New York or Los Angeles, where the fictional story is largely set. Toronto has been used to double for American urban environments for decades in film and television, but the specific challenge with The Boys is that so much of the show's identity is tied to a very specific vision of American power and American mythology. The production design team has to work incredibly hard to strip Toronto of its very recognizable Canadian visual identity and transform it into this heightened, slightly distorted vision of American corporate and superhero culture. There is actually a whole layer of the show that is built on this distortion idea. Vought Tower, the corporate headquarters of the superhero industrial complex in the show, is designed to be recognizable and yet slightly wrong in the way that the show's entire vision of America is recognizable and slightly wrong. The production designers have talked about wanting everything in Vaught's world to feel like it is just a few degrees off from reality, just exaggerated enough to be satirical without being so exaggerated that it loses its sting. Because satire only works when the thing being satirized is close enough to reality that the comparison lands. Speaking of Vought and corporate power, let's talk about one of the most underappreciated aspects of the show, which is how it functions as a critique of media and entertainment specifically, not just of superheroes in general. Vought is not just a company that makes superheroes. It is a media company, an entertainment company, a public relations machine. And the show is absolutely saturated with commentary about how media shapes perception, how stories can be manufactured and weaponized, how the line between heroism and marketing has essentially ceased to exist. This is directly connected to real conversations happening right now about the entertainment industry, about streaming culture, about how platforms like the one that broadcasts The Boys actually operate. There is a very deliberate and very ironic quality to the fact that The Boys, a show that is deeply critical of corporate media and corporate control of narrative, is itself a massive corporate streaming product. Kripke and his team are aware of this irony and have leaned into it in various ways throughout the show's run. It adds a layer of self-awareness that sophisticated viewers find genuinely rewarding. The Seven, the superhero team at the center of the show, were designed to function as a dark mirror of the Justice League. Every member of the Seven has an analog in DC Comics, and those parallels are not subtle. Homelander is Superman corrupted. Queen Maeve is Wonder Woman worn down by compromise. A-Train is the Flash consumed by insecurity and addiction. The Deep is Aquaman played as a figure of comedic humiliation. Black Noir is Batman stripped of the heroic mythology. These are deliberate design choices meant to force the audience to look at the superhero archetypes they love and ask what those archetypes would actually look like if they existed in the real world. And here is the fascinating thing about Black Noir specifically, because that character has one of the most interesting evolutions in the entire show. In the early seasons, Black Noir functions almost entirely as a silent, terrifying presence, an enigma. And the show's writers use that mystery very deliberately to build dread around the character. The eventual revelations about Black Noir's backstory and inner life represent one of the show's most surprising emotional pivots, taking what seemed like a straightforward menacing figure and revealing layers of tragedy underneath. The creative team has talked about this as an example of the show's broader strategy of hiding genuine emotional complexity inside characters who initially appear to be one-dimensional. Let's talk about the music in The Boys, because this is an element that does not get nearly enough attention, and yet it is one of the most carefully considered aspects of the production. The show uses licensed music in a very specific way, choosing songs that create ironic contrast with what is happening on screen. This technique is not new in film and television. Kubrick was doing it, Scorsese was doing it, but The Boys deploys it with a consistency and a precision that has become one of its most recognizable signatures. The decision to pair extreme violence or corporate horror with cheerful, familiar pop songs does something very specific psychologically to the viewer. It creates a kind of cognitive dissonance that is actually a core part of the show's message. The comfort we feel when we hear familiar music is being deliberately disrupted by the visual content, and that disruption mirrors exactly what the show wants us to feel about the larger cultural landscape it is depicting. The things that are packaged as comforting and familiar, including heroism, patriotism, and entertainment itself, contain something deeply disturbing underneath. The music choices are not just aesthetic. They are thematic. Now let me tell you something about Jensen Ackles and his addition to the show in Season 3 as Soldier Boy, because this is where things get genuinely fascinating on multiple levels. Ackles, of course, worked with Kripke for 15 years on Supernatural, playing Dean Winchester. So when he was cast in The Boys, there was already a deep professional and personal relationship between the actor and the showrunner. But here is what is interesting about how Soldier Boy was constructed. Soldier Boy is in some ways an even more pointed satirical creation than Homelander, because he represents a specific nostalgia, a longing for an imagined golden age of heroism that was never actually golden at all. He is a product of World War II-era mythology, the Greatest Generation narrative, the idea that there was a time when heroism was simple and pure and unambiguous. And the show systematically demolishes that idea. The contrast between the legend of Soldier Boy and the actual reality of who he is and what he did forms one of the show's sharpest and most interesting critiques of historical nostalgia. Ackles has talked about the physical preparation required for the role and also about the challenge of playing someone who is genuinely from a different era, who has been essentially frozen in his worldview and then thawed out into a present that he finds bewildering and contemptible. There is real comedy in that fish-out-of-water dimension of the character, but there is also real tragedy, because Soldier Boy is ultimately a person who is forged in a specific historical moment and cannot adapt beyond it. That inflexibility is presented as both dangerous and pathetic, which is a very precise satirical point. Here is something that genuinely blows people's minds when they first hear it. The training and physical preparation that the cast goes through for this show is extraordinary. Not just in the conventional action hero sense of building muscle and learning fight choreography, although that is certainly part of it, but the specific challenge of performing superpowered characters requires an enormous amount of work on how to move and hold your body in ways that suggest power that exists beyond normal human limits. Anthony Starr has talked about working with movement coaches specifically to develop Homelander's physical vocabulary, the way he occupies space, the way he enters rooms, the way his stillness can be more threatening than any action. This physical dimension of the performance extends to the flying sequences, which involve extensive work with wire rigs and green screen that then has to be seamlessly integrated in post-production. The technology involved in making the superhero powers look believable in the show's heightened realistic aesthetic is genuinely cutting edge, because unlike traditional superhero films, The Boys is trying to make powers look plausible in a world that otherwise resembles our own, which is actually a harder technical challenge than making them look spectacular in a world that is already fantastical. Let me now tell you about something in the writing room that has shaped the show in ways most viewers never consciously register. Kripke has assembled a writing team that brings a very specific set of cultural obsessions and political perspectives to the work. The show has writers who come from backgrounds in political comedy, in drama, in horror, and the way these different sensibilities interact in the room is directly visible in the final product. The Boys is genuinely unusual as a television show in that it can operate simultaneously as sharp political satire, as genuinely affecting emotional drama, and as a horror show with sequences that are legitimately disturbing. The writers have talked about the challenge of maintaining tonal consistency when you are working across such a wide range across a single episode. One scene might be darkly comedic, the next emotionally devastating, the next horrifying, and the challenge is making sure those transitions feel organic rather than jarring. The degree to which the show succeeds at this is really a product of those writers understanding the underlying thematic logic that unifies all those different registers. Because when you understand what the show is actually about, all the different tonal registers make sense as part of a coherent vision. Now let's talk about the character development of the Deep, because Chase Crawford's performance in this role is one of the show's most underrated achievements. The Deep starts out as a figure of contempt, a vain and entitled mediocrity who holds power he has not earned and uses that power abusively. And the show does something genuinely risky with this character across its seasons, which is to make his humiliation and his attempts at redemption genuinely pathetic and yet somehow still sympathetic. You do not forgive the Deep. The show does not ask you to, but you begin to understand him, and that understanding is a kind of dark comedy that Crawford plays with remarkable precision. Crawford has talked about drawing on the specifically coastal elite dimension of the character, the kind of person who has always been handed things and then is completely lost when those things are taken away. There is a very specific American archetype there, the person whose identity is entirely constructed from status and who has nothing underneath when the status disappears. The Deep's arc is in some ways the show's most direct comedy, but it is comedy with a point, about entitlement and accountability and the desperate lengths people will go to in order to avoid genuine self-reckoning. One of the most fascinating creative decisions in the history of the show involves a scene from Season 1 that has become probably the single most talked about and written about sequence in the entire series. I am talking about the whale scene. And what is interesting about the creation of that scene is not just the shock value of it, but the specific creative logic behind it. The writers have talked about how certain scenes in the show are designed to function as gauntlets, as moments that test whether the audience is truly committed to what the show is doing. If you can make it through the whale scene, you have signed on for the full experience. You have accepted the show's terms. This is actually a sophisticated storytelling technique borrowed from literary fiction, where certain passages serve as filters, separating readers who are genuinely engaged from those who are just along for the ride. The most memorable and extreme moments in The Boys are not gratuitous in the sense of being purposeless. They are always serving either a thematic function or a character function or both. And the creative team is very clear about that distinction. The violence and the extreme content are tools, and like any tool, they are only as good as the craftsmanship with which they are used. Let's talk about something that is genuinely important to understand about the show's relationship with its audience and with its cultural moment. The Boys arrived at a very specific time in the history of superhero entertainment. The Marvel Cinematic Universe was at the absolute peak of its cultural dominance when The Boys launched in 2019. The cultural conversation about superheroes was overwhelmingly positive and celebratory. And into that conversation, The Boys dropped like a grenade. But here is what is really interesting. The show has never been simply anti-superhero. It is not nihilistic about the genre. What it is doing is more sophisticated than that. It is asking what these stories actually mean, what values they reinforce, who they serve, and what they might be distracting us from. Those are legitimate questions, and the fact that The Boys asks them through entertainment, through extremely watchable, extremely well-made television, is precisely why it has had the cultural impact it has. It reaches people who might tune out a lecture but who will absolutely keep watching to find out what happens next. The show's engagement with real-world political events is something the writers have navigated very carefully and very deliberately. Events in the real world have a habit of catching up with the show's fictional scenarios in ways that are sometimes startling. Kripke has talked about moments where the writer's room was working on storylines that then became eerily resonant with actual news events, and the challenge of deciding whether to lean into that resonance or to recalibrate to avoid seeming exploitative. That navigation requires real sensitivity and real craft, and the degree to which the show has managed it successfully is part of why it has maintained its critical reputation across multiple seasons. Now here is something about the production that I find genuinely remarkable. The stunt work on The Boys is, by any measure, some of the most complex and ambitious stunt work happening anywhere in television. The specific challenge is that you are staging fights between people who are supposed to have superhuman power and people who absolutely do not, and making that power differential feel visceral and real rather than just technical. The stunt coordinators have talked about developing entirely new approaches to fight choreography specifically for the show, ways of staging and shooting combat that communicate the overwhelming physical dominance of soup characters while still keeping the normal human characters dramatically viable. This extends to the work done by Nathan Mitchell, who plays Black Noir, because that character requires an entirely physical performance with no dialogue and no visible facial expression. Everything Mitchell communicates has to come through body language, through movement, through presence. And creating a character who reads clearly and emotionally to audiences entirely through physical performance, especially one who is often in conflict with characters of very different scale and power, requires extraordinary skill both from the performer and from the choreographers and directors working with him. Let me tell you something about the show that I think is the most underappreciated thing about it overall, and that is the quality of its emotional core. For all the conversation about the violence and the satire and the political commentary, The Boys is ultimately a show about people trying to maintain their humanity under conditions that are designed to destroy it. Every major character in the show is engaged in that struggle, whether they know it or not. Billy Butcher is trying to hold on to the love that drives him even as his methods become increasingly monstrous. Starlight is trying to hold on to her values inside a machine designed to commodify them. Even Homelander, in his deeply broken way, is reaching for something like genuine connection and finding only the hollow performance of it. That emotional architecture is what elevates the show above pure provocation. And it is what keeps audiences coming back season after season, even when the content is genuinely difficult. People are not watching for the spectacle alone. They are watching because they care what happens to these characters, and because the show, beneath all its shock and satire, is genuinely asking meaningful questions about what it means to be human in a world that constantly pressures you to be something else. There is one more thing I want to tell you about before we wrap this up, and it is something that speaks to the long-term ambition of what Kripke and his team have been building. From the very beginning, The Boys was conceived not as a show that would run indefinitely, squeezing content out of a franchise until it collapsed under its own weight, but as a story with a specific ending, a specific destination it was always moving toward. This is increasingly rare in the streaming era, where the commercial incentives push toward endless continuation and spin-off proliferation. The decision to treat the show as a finite story with real stakes and real consequences, where things actually end and characters actually face the results of their choices, is what gives the show its narrative integrity. That commitment to ending, to meaning, to the idea that stories should arrive somewhere rather than just continue forever, is reflected in every creative decision the show makes. The willingness to do irreversible things, to change the status quo in ways that cannot be walked back, to let characters be genuinely lost, is directly connected to the show's awareness that it is building toward something. And that awareness, that sense of purpose and direction, is something audiences feel even when they cannot articulate it. It is the difference between a show that holds your attention and a show that earns it. So the next time you sit down to watch The Boys, I want you to carry some of this with you. Think about the New Zealanders playing the most American archetypes imaginable. Think about the music choices and what they are telling you. Think about the specific emotional wounds that drive every character's choices. Think about the satirical precision underneath all the chaos. Because this show is built with more care and more intention than almost anything else on television right now. And now that you know what to look for, you are going to see it everywhere. If this video gave you something new to think about, hit that like button and let me know in the comments which of these facts genuinely surprised you the most. I am particularly curious whether anyone already knew about the New Zealand connection, because that one gets people every single time. Subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one, because we are just getting started. There is so much more to unpack about this show, and I will see you in the next video.